60,000 people. 60,000 people. Imagine that as headstones. That would make a rather large cemetery, wouldn't it? 60,000 people. Just been looking at the excess death figures. On Dr. John Campbell's recent video, he was talking about these excess deaths. He got the data from somebody called ourworldindata.org that seems to look at the data around the world and collate it and put it up. We haven't been printing in the UK. The ONS doesn't seem to have released figures, I think, fairly recently for things like excess deaths related to the vaccine. So these are just excess death figures. It could be accountable to all sorts of different measures. So can't quantify exactly what it is. But these are excess deaths, the figures of, by percentage, over in recent times against what would have, say, in the last, figures, say, collated in January, that sort of time, end of last year, against what you would expect over and above what you would expect, say, in the last 3 to 5 years, what was normal. So excess death, pretty much self-explanatory, isn't it? It's curious, really, because these figures are quite surprising, seeing as these are figures over and above, and yet it doesn't seem to be much of a worry for certain organisations like the mainstream media, for example, or even worse, the government. So let's just have a look at some of them, and I urge you to go and have a look at John Campbell's video. He goes into it in a lot more detail, of course, but these figures came from their own website. I've gone and had a look. So in Australia, they've got 9% of excess deaths. They've had that over and above what you would normally expect, 9% of the population. So not 9% of the population, but 9% excess deaths than they would normally have from whatever that population is. So I suppose that's how you work out the physical numbers. Canada, only 3%, so I suppose that's not too bad. Denmark, an incredible 30%. 30% excess death over and above what you would expect. I don't know how that translates into actual numbers of individual people who have sadly died, but it sounds extremely tragic. In England, it's 20%. And I gather that equates to roughly 60,000 people. As I say, that is one very large cemetery. Now, you would imagine that 60,000 people dying over and above the normal number that you would expect would be something that a government would immediately want to talk about. There would be questions in the House. How can that be? And the mainstream media, I'm really surprised that journalists, those journalists who we recognise their faces, they've become household names in many people's houses, who still put on the mainstream media, that is. I don't actually have a television anymore. I started to mistrust what I heard on the mainstream media, but that's just me, that I'm sure everything that they say is absolutely correct and would be of no bias whatsoever, particularly on the BBC. And they would have no reason not to talk about things that were of absolute paramount importance to the country. That's their job, isn't it? That's their job to bring up these things. So when you look at 20% excess deaths in the last 5 to 10 years, that 60,000 people have died, presumably, on their own at home with their family, not in one big hit as if a bomb had dropped and killed them all in one go. Of course, that would be like a terrorist attack. Then clearly it's not that. It's not any sort of terror, nothing terrible in that way, but something presumably that's happened in the last year or so has caused people to die excessively in these larger numbers. And, on the one hand, you can't help thinking it's almost like, because these figures go on and on. For example, Finland 9%, France 25%, Germany an amazing 43% excess deaths, Hungary 11, Ireland 20, the Netherlands 37. It just goes on and on. I mean, it's absolutely quite frightening. Scotland, for example, 13%, South Korea 18%. The figures are there. But it's almost as if the whole world just picked up a bottle of bleach and guzzled it down, and as a result of that, complications came and they've died a little bit more than you would expect. I mean, it really is as if something has happened. I can't think, can you? I can't think what unusual circumstances happen. Now, I should say, of course, these excess deaths are not to do with COVID. Those COVID deaths have been recorded. We saw that during 2020 and 2021. So we saw that they were recorded. So these have nothing to do with that. These are something else. Something else must have happened then after the virus came about and was killing people very sadly. Something else must have happened, something that the whole world engaged in. I just can't really think what that could possibly be. Something that, you know, might have been promoted, I suppose, as safe and effective, and then it turns out that it isn't actually safe, but it might have been effective, depending on what the effect is you were after, I guess. That could have been good. Yes, so it's surprising, really, that the mainstream media don't want to touch it, don't want to talk about it, which makes you think it can't be a problem, can it? The government certainly don't want to talk about it. And that's curious, really, because if the people want to talk about it and they go on social media and other video platforms and they start hearing about these excess deaths and think, hello, it's a bit strange. Why would the government not want to entertain this idea? Can we trust the government? That would be a question that I would certainly start to have. Could we trust a government that nobody's asking those questions? Could we trust our MPs, for example, if perhaps people were writing, as I know people have been telling me they've been writing to their MPs and about a certain thing, and all they're getting back is these same two words, safe and effective. And again, I question just what they mean by effective. And then yet nobody's talking about it. So when you come to an election, if people have absolutely no faith in the government, and not just the government, in the shadow government as well, or any of the other parties who are not really asking for answers about this, what to me would seem like an extremely important issue, and yet it's not. It's just being pushed aside as no, nothing to see here. It's almost willful blindness. No, nothing to worry about. So one has to assume that there is nothing to worry about, that 60,000 people in England died unexpectedly for no apparent reason, that's got nothing to do with anything that was maybe mandated or forced upon us, or people were pressured or persuaded to take. It clearly must mean that it doesn't have any bearing on any of that the government wouldn't want to talk about it. But I find that strange and rather worrying. I'd be interested to know what you think. Is it strange? Is it worrying that the mainstream media and the government just don't seem to want to acknowledge that? And how does that make you feel coming up to an election in which we've got to try and vote for somebody to look after us, to be beneficial to us, benevolent and caring, and have our best interests, to the sovereign people? The people, by the way, who put them there. I wonder what your thoughts are on all of that.